Bombings over Nazi Germany. Strategic bombings during World War II transformed the conflict into a total war, where not only military targets but also critical infrastructure and entire cities were attacked. From the start of the war, the German Luftwaffe employed this tactic to support its offensives, as seen in the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Blitz over the United Kingdom in 1940 and 1941. However, as the conflict progressed, the Allies responded with an unprecedented aerial campaign over Germany. Starting in 1943, Allied bombings intensified, targeting not just factories and railways, but also the civilian population as part of a strategy to weaken the enemy's morale. Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg left the city in ruins, while the attack on Dresden in 1945 became one of the most devastating episodes of the conflict. Berlin, Nuremberg and Munich were also targets of offensives that altered the course of the war. How were these bombings carried out, and what did they leave in their wake? Hell in Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah. The assault began on the night of July 24th to 25th, 1943, when 791 British aircraft launched an attack on Hamburg. The Church of St. Nicholas, located in the heart of the city, was selected as the primary target. However, a large number of explosives impacted more distant areas, significantly expanding the area of destruction. Flames spread rapidly through the city centre and the districts of Hoheluft, Eimsbüttel and Altona. Some peripheral areas in the northwest were also affected. The authorities in charge of anti-aircraft defence estimated approximately 20,000 fatalities. During the afternoon of July 25th, 40 American bombers launched an attack against port facilities, successfully sinking several vessels. Factories specializing in mineral oil refining, located nearby, were also affected. The following day at noon, 71 USAAF aircraft repeated the offensive against the port, this time striking the Neuhof power plant. In these two daytime incursions, approximately 150 civilians were reported killed. The fourth strike within Operation Gomorrah occurred between the night of July 26th and the early morning of July 27th. It was a harassment attack involving 6 British Mosquito aircraft, although material damage was minimal. The second major night assault by the RAF took place on July 27, 1943, when 739 aircraft participated in a devastating bombing over districts east of the city centre. The flames generated by the explosions, combined with unusual meteorological conditions, resulted in a firestorm. Hurricane-force winds at ground level fueled the fire. Rothenburg Sort, Hammerbrook and Borgfelder were practically razed. The flames also wreaked havoc in Hamm, Eilbeck, Hohenfelde, Barmbek and Wandsbek. In this attack, around 30,000 civilians lost their lives. The third large-scale bombing occurred on the night of July 29th to 30th, 1943. A total of 726 British bombers attacked Barmbek, Uhlenhorst and Winterhude. Although fires were started, no phenomenon similar to that of July 27th occurred. Despite Barmbek having a similar population and building density to Hammerbrook, the conditions were different. The exact number of fatalities is uncertain, but some sources place it near 1,000. The night of August 2nd to 3rd marked the 7th and final assault of Operation Gomorrah. For this offensive, the RAF mobilized 740 aircraft. Hamburg was bombed amid an electrical storm, affecting the precision of the attacks. As a result, the damage was dispersed and less directed. Multiple fires were started, including one that consumed the city's opera house, but none spread with the same intensity as in previous bombings. The bombings combined the use of explosives and incendiary devices. The initial detonations destroyed roofs and covers of buildings, allowing the phosphorus from the subsequent incendiaries to penetrate directly into the interiors and staircases. These structures, mostly made of wood, rapidly spread the flames to the lower floors, causing entire buildings to burn down to their foundations. Each aerial offensive focused on a specific area of the city. As a visual reference, British pilots used the tower of the St. Nikolai Church, which stood at 147.3 meters tall. Today, the remains of this church stand as a monument to the devastation caused by Operation Gomorrah. Underground shelters designed to protect the civilian population offered increasingly limited safety in the final stages of the conflict. As the war progressed, the size and power of the explosives used increased, making it difficult for shelter structures to withstand the impacts. Additionally, the large number of fires caused a severe oxygen shortage inside the bunkers, leading to the asphyxiation of numerous people trapped within. The exact number of victims of Operation Gomorrah remains uncertain. By November 30th, 1943, 31,647 bodies had been recovered, of which 15,802 were identified. The authorities in charge of anti-aircraft defense estimated the total number of fatalities at 35,000 at that time. More recent investigations suggest a figure close to 34,000 dead and 150,000 injured. The shelters proved insufficient to guarantee the safety of the population. Therefore, it was decided to evacuate residents from areas where it was still possible, such as in the case of Barmbek. All those not involved in the production of war materials were forced to leave the city. Most of the children were relocated to rural regions under the Kinderlandverschickung program to distance them from the danger. After the attacks, approximately 900,000 residents of Hamburg had to flee and were rehoused in various locations, including Bavaria, present-day Poland, and territories of East Germany. Dresden in flames. Since the spring of 1944, Dresden experienced an increase in air raid alerts. The first attack occurred on August 24th, when bombers directed their projectiles against a refinery of Renania Ossag in Freital-Birkicht and the industry located in Dresden-Gittersee. One of the explosions affected the district of Dresden-Koschutz. According to reports from the newspaper Sächsische Zeitung, this attack left a toll of 241 dead. On October 7, 1944, a group of 30 American aircraft dropped approximately 80 tons of explosives over the railway station of Friedrichstadt and the arms factory Lehmann. Their initial target was a coal liquefaction plant in Brux, now Most, Czech Republic, but upon failing to reach it, they diverted their attack. Some bombs impacted Seevorstadt, west of the Altstadt, causing the death of 312 people. A new attack was recorded on January 16, 1945. On this occasion, 133 American bombers dropped throughout the day 279.8 tons of explosives and 41.6 tons of incendiary bombs over the station of Friedrichstadt. The explosions also damaged areas of Dresden-Löbtau and Leutewitz. As a result of the offensive, 334 inhabitants died. The air raids significantly weakened the city's anti-aircraft defense. In the base of Dresden-Klotsche, only 30 aircraft, including day and night fighters, remained operational with scarce fuel supplies. Despite this, in the same month, the anti-aircraft batteries were sent to the Eastern Front. Poor weather conditions led the United States to cede the leadership of the first attack to the British RAF. A two-phase offensive was planned, separated by 3 hours, with the intention that the second strike would hit the rescue teams attempting to extinguish the fires started in the first wave. Simultaneously, other cities such as Magdeburg, Nuremberg, Bonn, Berlin and Misburg were to be attacked to confuse German forces. At 5:20 p.m. on February 13, 1945, a squadron of Avro Lancasters took off from the United Kingdom headed for Dresden, covering more than 1,100 kilometers. Their mission was to illuminate the city with magnesium flares dropped by parachute, which the Germans called Christmas trees. These aircraft, known as Pathfinders, marked the zone for the following bombers. Afterward, several de Havilland Mosquitoes took off with the task of signaling the strategic points using 1,000-pound markers. These devices produced an intense red glow, serving as a guide for the bombers. The impact zone was set at the Heinz-Steyr Stadion, northwest of the center. Finally, the main force of the offensive, codenamed Plate Rack, consisting of 254 Lancasters carrying 500 tons of explosives and 375 tons of incendiary material, took off. In total, they carried 200,000 incendiary devices and bombs ranging from 500 to 4,000 pounds, including the so-called 2-ton blockbusters capable of leveling an entire block of buildings. The aircraft entered French airspace crossing the Somme River and then entered Germany north of Köln. At 10 p.m., the unit headed for Berlin separated from the main convoy. At that moment, 10 Lancasters had suffered damage that prevented them from continuing, leaving 244 aircraft en route to Dresden, the Florence of the Elbe. At 9:51 p.m. on the Tuesday of Carnival, February 13, 1945, Dresden heard another air raid alert, the 175th since the start of the war. The night was clear with no trace of clouds. Citizens hurried to seek refuge, heading to the basements of houses or the few bunkers still available. Towards 10:03 p.m., the British Pathfinder bombers illuminated the urban centre with their flares. 2 minutes later, 9 Mosquitoes marked the targets with red signals over the stadium. At 10:14 p.m., the first bombs hit the city. In just 8 minutes, the Lancasters dropped their armament southwest of the marked point, covering a fan-shaped area of 45 degrees, from the curve of the Elbe to the industrial zone of Ostergehege and the central train station, located 2.5 kilometers south. The powerful blockbusters collapsed roofs and broke down doors and windows, allowing the fires started by the incendiary bombs to spread rapidly. In less than 20 minutes, 3/4 of the historic centre was ablaze. The night attack did not focus on destroying specific points, but on annihilating the urban centre entirely with carpet bombing. At 1:05 a.m., the sirens sounded again. Without electrical supply, manual alarms were used. At 1:23 a.m., a second wave of 529 British bombers from Squadrons 1, 3, 6 and 8 resumed the offensive. From nearly 100 kilometers away, the flames were visible, and from the air the glow could be seen up to 800 kilometers away. The smoke reached 4,600 meters high. Between 1:23 a.m. and 1:54 a.m., the attackers dropped 650,000 incendiary bombs, weighing approximately 1,500 tons, which destroyed areas from Lübthau to Blasewitz and from Neustadt to Schörtnitz. The gigantic fire started in the first offensive served as a reference for the second, whose bombs impacted the fields near the Elbe and the Grosser Garten, where numerous inhabitants had taken refuge. In the midst of the attack, hospitals such as the Pfotenhauer Clinic and the Diakonissen Krankenhaus were also damaged. The second bombing prevented any effort to extinguish the fire. Within minutes, the flames merged into a firestorm of devastating proportions, destroying entire streets and buildings. The extreme heat melted glass and metal. The wind generated by the voracious combustion swept away everything in its path, including people and objects, which were consumed by the fire, affected by the thermal shock or lack of oxygen. After the first bombing in 1944, the Air Defense Organization had connected basements and shelters, allowing some to escape to less affected areas. Witnesses recounted how some managed to traverse this underground labyrinth and reach the banks of the Elbe. However, many others died asphyxiated, trapped in spaces invaded by toxic gases from the fire. Following the night attacks, a daytime bombing took place between 12:17 p.m. and 12:31 p.m. on February 14, 1945. The offensive was carried out by 316 B-17 Flying Fortresses belonging to the 1st Division of the 8th Bomber Command of the U.S. Air Force, accompanied by hundreds of escort fighters. Under adverse weather conditions, the H-2X radar was used to locate the targets. The city received approximately 474.5 tons of explosive bombs and 296.5 tons of incendiaries, totaling 771 tons of munitions. Some aircraft failed to correctly identify the attack points and dropped their loads over Brux, Pilsen and Prague, where 153 tons of explosives were dropped. The primary objective was to destroy armament factories, the Friedrichstadt station and its repair workshops. However, the still imperfect radar dispersed the bombs away from the targets, affecting nearby areas. At 35 kilometers away, in Neustadt in Sachsen, the ashes from the night bombings fell like rain. On February 15th, at 10:15 a.m., the Frauenkirche, devastated by the fire, collapsed. Later, between 11:51 a.m. and 12:10 p.m., 211 B-17s attacked again, with 460 tons of explosives, distributed across areas from Meissen to Pirna. Despite the attempts, the Friedrichstadt station was not destroyed. On March 2nd, 455 B-17s of the U.S. Air Force headed towards the Hydria Werk Schwarzheide liquefaction plant, but diverted their course to bomb Dresden, aiming to disable the railway lines. Starting at 10:27 a.m., they dropped 940.3 tons of explosives, and 140.5 tons of incendiaries over the stations of Friedrichstadt, Neustadt, and surrounding buildings. Werner von Gilsa took command of the local defense after the February attack, succeeding Friedrich Wilhelm Liegmann. His headquarters were established in the Taschenberg Palace, later moving to the Albertstadt camp. He ordered the use of Luftwaffe food and medical supply warehouses in Nicken to aid the affected. Additionally, he coordinated the arrival of refugees and reorganized soldiers with permits or minor injuries into new units. On April 10th, the Gauleiter Mutschmann ordered the construction of temporary classrooms and shelters for school children on the terrace of Brühl. The last bombing occurred on April 17th with 572 aircraft of the U.S. 8th Air Force. They dropped 1,526.4 tons of explosives and 164.5 tons of incendiaries over the stations, along with an additional 28 tons over an unidentified factory. This offensive definitively interrupted railway traffic in the city. The Nazi regime took advantage of the destruction to reinforce the defenses with the last survivors. On April 14th, Mutschmann officially declared Dresden a fortress. On April 23rd, the RAF dropped 40,000 propaganda leaflets over the city. Following the capitulation of Berlin on May 2nd, Gilsa disbanded the Dresden defense and began the evacuation. Scattered groups continued the resistance until the unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, when the Red Army took complete control of the city. Dresden, in its central area, housed a large number of residents and combined commercial buildings with historic structures. After the attacks, the Altstadt was almost entirely engulfed in flames. Although some structures remained standing, they suffered severe damage. Areas such as Seevorstadt, Johannstadt and Südvorstadt were devastated, while in Michten, Strahlen and Grunau, the destruction was also significant. In the districts of Reich, Friedrichstadt, Plauen, Schörtnitz and Neustadt, the impact was severe, and in Prochlis the flames spread rapidly. Along Schandauer and Bodenbacher Strasse, approximately 800 buildings containing around 7,000 homes, as well as workshops and factories, were reduced to rubble. The bombing resulted in the loss of notable late Baroque buildings, such as the Semperoper, the Frauenkirche, the Palace, and the Sophienkirche. Years later, under the GDR government, some damaged structures were demolished, although a few ruins were preserved as a reminder of the disaster. Although the night raids did not specifically target armament industries, nearly 70% of the city's manufacturing sector was destroyed. Essential services such as electricity, gas and water were also severely affected. Of the 222,000 existing homes, between 60,000 and 75,000 were completely destroyed, 18,000 suffered serious damage, and 81,000 had minor damage. Around 30% of commercial establishments were out of operation. The transportation system was inoperative. Approximately 75% of the catenary wires were destroyed, and the streets were blocked by craters and piles of debris. All the bridges over the Elbe River suffered considerable damage. Although rail activity began to resume partially within 2 weeks, troop transport could restart within a few days. Many factories ceased operations due to the destruction of their facilities, lack of personnel, or inability to receive supplies. By March 1945, only 6 factories remained active. The slaughterhouse in Ostragehege resumed operations on February 19th, while the bakery on Rosenstrasse reopened in March. By that date, around 4,000 people still resided in the city centre. Distribution points for food were established, although supplies soon began to run out. Until April, public assistance did not take charge of the affected. The city, lacking sufficient officials and operational facilities, was unable to manage the crisis effectively. Since the end of the conflict, the number of fatalities in the Dresden bombings has been a subject of analysis by historians. The difficulty in establishing precise figures lies in the fact that, although the population was 642,000 in 1939, at the time of the air raid, the city housed around 200,000 refugees and thousands of wounded soldiers. Bombings over Berlin, the inconclusive offensive. The air campaign against Berlin, also known as the Berlin Bombing Offensive or the Battle of Berlin, consisted of a series of attacks carried out by the Royal Air Force, RAF, and the United States Army Air Forces, USAAF. This siege, developed between November 1943 and March 1944, aimed to force Germany's surrender and end World War II without the need for a ground invasion. However, the strategy failed. Arthur Harris, 1892–1984, chief of the RAF Bomber Command, had support at the highest levels to execute night saturation attacks on factories and industrial centers in German territory. Before the offensive on Berlin, both the RAF and the USAAF had conducted joint operations against strategic targets such as the Ruhr Industrial Basin, Battle of the Ruhr, March–July 1943, and Hamburg, which suffered enormous damage during Operation Gomorrah, July–August of the same year. In these incursions, the RAF usually operated at night, while the USAAF carried out daytime attacks. By mid-1943, Allied leaders began focusing on planning the invasion of the European continent. In June, they issued the point-blank directive, whose primary objective was to weaken German fighter aircraft production, which could pose a threat in the future ground offensive planned for the following summer in Normandy, Operation Overlord. To ensure the success of that invasion, achieving air superiority was crucial. However, Harris doubted the effectiveness of selective bombings against key installations, such as armament factories. His skepticism was reflected in the USAF raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg. In August 1943, the first USAAF attempt in Schweinfurt failed to destroy the strategic ball-bearing factories and suffered heavy aircraft losses. However, in October, a new attack yielded better results. Berlin housed essential war industries, leading Harris to propose a more generalized bombing tactic instead of targeted strikes. Additionally, the city played a crucial role in transportation and was a key symbol of German power. The British commander argued that a series of massive air raids over Berlin could force Germany to surrender, eliminating the need for a costly and prolonged ground campaign. However, the plan had several drawbacks. Berlin was significantly more extensive than other previously attacked cities, requiring constant bombing to achieve considerable damage. Aware of this, Harris requested a fleet of 6,000 bombers, but that number was never available. At its peak, the RAF and the USAAF together had approximately 3,000 bombing aircraft. Additionally, Berlin's air defenses were formidable, with more than 100 anti-aircraft batteries protecting the city. Historian M. Hastings describes Berlin as the most extensive and best-defended urban industrial complex in Europe. According to our Nylans, the German capital presented enormous challenges for the attackers. Its deep location within enemy territory, its proximity to the eastern border, and its considerable size made navigation and identification of specific targets difficult. One of the major drawbacks in 1943 was the insufficient range of Allied fighter aircraft, which prevented them from escorting bombers to the deepest targets within Germany. Another key factor was that previous campaigns, such as the 1,000-bomber raid against Cologne in 1942, had not weakened the population's morale, despite the high number of casualties and widespread destruction. This had already been observed when the Germans attacked British cities and London at the beginning of the conflict. Even if the German population became demoralized, the tight control of the totalitarian state made it unlikely that they could influence political decisions. Despite these challenges, the Joint Chiefs of Staff approved Harris's strategy and authorized the deployment of bombers over Berlin. The USAAF, which prioritized targets such as the German oil infrastructure, only joined the offensive in its final stage. Consequently, the RAF carried out most of the attacks alone, confident that its air offensive would subdue the city nicknamed Big B. The RAF's most powerful aircraft was the Lancaster, a 4-engine bomber capable of carrying up to 6,350 kilograms of explosives. Other models used included the Halifax and Sterling. To confuse enemy fighters, de Havilland Mosquito bombers were deployed, carrying up to 1,814 kilograms of bombs and conducting diversionary incursions. The USAAF used the B-17 Flying Fortress with a payload capacity of 2,722 kilograms and the B-24 Liberator. The first attacks on Berlin occurred between late August and early September 1943. In total, 1,647 bombers participated in the raids. but 126 were shot down by enemy fighters, such as the Messerschmitt Bf-109, or by anti-aircraft artillery. The route to the German capital also presented challenges, and unforeseen events increased the losses. With a loss rate of 7.7%, maintaining the offensive was considered unsustainable, leading to the suspension of operations until the nights became longer, as darkness offered better protection for the slow bombers. On November 18th, the attacks resumed. This time, a diversionary maneuver was organized in other locations, resulting in only 9 of the 444 dispatched bombers being shot down. Until November, 3 additional offensives were carried out. In December, the campaign continued with 4 more raids, while Harris insisted on his plan to subdue Berlin. Throughout these operations, the aircraft loss rate hovered around 5%, but persistent cloud cover made it difficult to confirm the precise extent of the destruction caused. Weather conditions often became an obstacle even before reaching the target. In the early morning of December 17th, 25 Lancaster bombers crashed after takeoff due to dense fog. The accumulation of aircraft in the same space also posed dangers, as recalled by John Cochrane, a gunner on a bomber. One of the most striking moments I experienced occurred during my squadron's first mission over Berlin. After dropping the bombs, the formations had to cross paths in the air, which created a dangerous overlap. On that occasion, a squadron flying above us dropped its load directly onto our aircraft. One of our planes was hit, and that moment remains etched in my memory as a terrifying episode I will never forget. The raids continued in January 1944 with 5 new attacks, but Harris faced increasing pressure to redirect the bombers towards specific installations related to German aircraft production. Bad weather continued to be a problem, halting operations for 14 days, while losses increased to 7%. On February 15th, the offensive became even costlier. Of 891 bombers dispatched, 42 did not return. On March 24th, the losses were even higher, a 9% loss of the fleet, equivalent to 72 aircraft. This level of losses was unsustainable. The RAF operated with approximately 900 active bombers, and if losses exceeded 6%, the probability of a crew completing its 30 missions without being shot down became virtually nil. Additionally, replacing both aircraft and trained personnel became challenging. Germany, despite the damage suffered, showed no signs of surrender. In March, the US 8th Air Force, based in Britain, intensified the bombings over Berlin, increasing the suffering of its inhabitants. However, the Allied strategy did not produce the desired results. The RAF lost 492 aircraft in a total of 16 major raids on the German capital. On March 6th alone, a daytime mission by the USAF left 69 bombers shot down by the increasingly effective air defenses. Other cities were also targeted, such as Nuremberg in March 1944, where the RAF suffered the loss of around 100 aircraft. If the entire offensive had been concentrated on Berlin, the Luftwaffe could have exclusively reinforced the city's defenses. With the approach of spring 1944, the Allies' priorities shifted. Preparations for D-Day absorbed the resources of the Bomber Command. Although Berlin was severely damaged, it did not fall. From a strategic standpoint, the air offensive against the German capital represented a failure for the Allies. Although the air offensive over Berlin did not achieve Germany's surrender, the consequences were devastating. The bombings combined explosives with incendiary devices. The former perforated roofs and floors of buildings, allowing the latter to slide in and cause massive fires. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 400,000 inhabitants lost their homes due to the attacks. In November alone, around 4,000 people died. However, as the campaign progressed, the number of casualties decreased proportionally as thousands of displaced people chose to leave the city to escape the destruction. Black Friday, the Nuremberg disaster. During the night of March 30th to 31st, 1944, the British Bomber Command carried out what would become its riskiest mission against Nuremberg. This attack turned into the greatest setback suffered by British aviation during the entire conflict and, simultaneously, one of the most successful days for German night air defences. Until then, Nuremberg, a key city for Nazi Party rallies, had been the target of 5 previous RAF raids, with limited effectiveness. Its distant location from Britain and frequent adverse weather conditions had prevented decisive strikes. However, for the British, it was a strategically important point, not only for its ideological value but also because its southern zone housed the factories of the Mann Company, producers of diesel engines for submarines and essential components for panzer tanks. Additionally, around 120 armament companies operated in its vicinity. Given that the offensive in Europe was imminent, the British High Command decided it was time to launch a large-scale assault to weaken German war supplies. Despite continuous Allied attacks, the German war machine maintained a high production rate. Under the direction of Arthur Harris, who had led the Bomber Command since February 1942, it was decided to employ all available resources in a massive bombing operation. Although the operation specifically targeted the factories, it did not rule out impacting the rest of the city, as its destruction would also contribute to reducing German war capabilities. The planning was kept in absolute secrecy, and extreme measures were taken to prevent leaks. During the preliminary meetings, even the use of public telephones was restricted to prevent any information from being leaked. The itinerary designed for the offensive established that the air fleet would first advance towards southern Belgium, then turn eastwards to reach the southern area of Kassel, from where it would head to the main target. The retreat would be carried out through Stuttgart and northern France. This final stretch represented the greatest danger, as it crossed an area heavily monitored by German night fighters, which would undoubtedly be on high alert. One of the key elements for the operation's success was the diversion strategy. Several units, mostly Mosquito aircraft specialized in marking targets, and 50 Halifax bombers were ordered to move north to deceive German defenses about the true destination of the mission. In total, the Bomber Command assembled 58 squadrons of bombers and 9 Mosquito aircraft, amounting to an impressive force of 795 aircraft. Of these, 572 were Lancasters and 214 were Halifaxes. Never before or after in the war was such a large aerial contingent deployed against Nuremberg. The takeoff began at 8 p.m. on March 30th, 1944. The plan established that between 1:05 a.m. and 1:22 a.m. the target would be marked, followed by a 12-minute execution of the attack. To reduce radar detection, the flight altitude was carefully calculated. Upon leaving the British coast, the fleet would maintain an altitude of 600 meters, gradually ascending to 2,400 meters upon crossing Belgium. From there, the ascent would continue until reaching between 6,000 and 6,500 meters at the time of the bombing. The programmed speed for the attack was 250 kilometers per hour, increasing to 300 kilometers per hour during the return. Additionally, weather forecasts indicated favorable conditions in the target area, reinforcing confidence in the mission's success. That night, it was planned that around 3,000 tons of bombs would impact the designated target. Of this total, 1,176 tons were incendiaries, while 900 consisted of high explosive bombs. However, problems began immediately. The Mosquito aircraft, tasked with the initial assessment, failed to detect that the weather conditions in Belgium were unfavorable. The formation was supposed to fly with clear skies and a full moon, without the expected cloud cover. Despite this, the bombers advanced at a steady pace within enemy territory. On the opposing side, the Luftwaffe controllers were not deceived. When the first bomber was hit by anti-aircraft fire near Liège, the Germans deduced that such a compact formation could only be headed east. Quickly, they put all-night fighter squadrons on alert. British pilots soon noticed the efficiency of their opponents. In the 72-kilometer stretch between the German border and the Rhine River, the RAF lost 10 Lancaster aircraft, 2 Halifax bombers, and 2 other aircraft suffered severe damage. The mission had barely begun. The outlook became even more disheartening with an unexpected phenomenon. Normally, condensation trails appear above 7,600 meters, but on this occasion, they began to form between 5,700 and 6,000 meters, precisely at the altitude of the British bombers. The full moon illuminated them, turning them into easy targets. Meanwhile, the Allies were unaware that the Luftwaffe had equipped its fighters with an innovative system. 2 20mm cannons installed at an 80-degree angle in the fuselage. This allowed the pilots to attack from below without being detected by the bombers' gunners. They fired at the internal engines, where the fuel tanks were located. The new method proved devastating. In a single mission, 2 Luftwaffe crews destroyed 4 bombers with just 56 projectiles. For his part, the German ace Martin Becker, who would have 58 victories by the end of the war, shot down 6 aircraft in just 30 minutes over the Ruhr region. When the formation reached the southern turning point, it had already lost 41 Lancasters and 18 Halifax bombers in just 1 hour. Never had the RAF registered so many losses in such a short time. There were still about 20 minutes to the target when several bombers made a fatal error. They turned too early and at a lower altitude than planned. The German fighters took advantage of the confusion and shot down 10 more aircraft. 45 kilometers from the destination, the situation worsened. A dense cloud layer, ranging between 600 and 3,500 meters, complicated visibility. Some of those tasked with marking the target became disoriented and attacked an incorrect population. During this phase, 39 bombers were destroyed in the approach and over the target area. At the start of the bombing, the attacking force had already lost 79 aircraft due to enemy fighters and 82 in total, including those downed by anti-aircraft fire. Of all the downed crews, only 1 managed to survive. Despite the losses, 512 aircraft managed to drop their bombs, but without effectiveness. Upon returning, the British encountered a headwind, which reduced the aircraft's speed and also hindered the pursuit by German fighters. However, the Luftwaffe continued to cause havoc. 3 aircraft were shot down before leaving Germany, while another 7 fell near the canal. Among them was Becker's last victory of that mission, who pursued the bombers until he almost ran out of fuel. Upon reaching the British coasts, 2 more aircraft were hit by anti-aircraft fire. By the end of the operation, the balance was catastrophic for the RAF. 109 aircraft lost, of which 96 were shot down in combat, and 10 crashed without the possibility of repair. The human cost was devastating. 545 crew members died, and 160 were taken prisoner. A striking fact about that mission was that in a single day, the Royal Air Force lost more crew members than during the entire Battle of Britain. In contrast, the German night fighters suffered the loss of only 10 aircraft, and just 11 of their pilots died in combat. The real impact on Nuremberg was minimal in strategic terms. There were 133 fatalities, of which 72 were within the city. The destruction affected 198 homes, and 96 industrial facilities suffered varying degrees of damage, but within 2 weeks, industrial production was operating normally. For the German night fighters, that operation was the most successful of the entire war. Practically all the pilots managed to shoot down at least 1 enemy. Martin Drews, who would end the war with 52 victories, added 3 on that day. Rudolf Frank, shot down in combat less than a month later, achieved a total of 45 victories, 3 of which occurred that night. Another ace, James H. Speth, who would fall in April 1945 with 34 victories to his name, shot down 3 bombers in that incursion. Another pilot, who would end the conflict with 25 enemy aircraft destroyed, achieved 4 victories in just 26 minutes, including 2 in the Nuremberg area itself. However, the greatest success of the day went to Martin Becker, who aboard his Bf 110G4 left his mark by shooting down 27 aircraft. The result was devastating for the British Bomber Command. Criticism of Arthur Harris and his strategy was immediate. Such was the impact of the massacre that the RAF took 7 months to attack Nuremberg again. While for the Germans, that day remained their greatest victory. In RAF history, it is remembered as the tragic Black Friday. Skies of Fire, the assault on Munich. Following the disastrous American incursion on March 6, 1944, it became clear that despite its weakening, the Luftwaffe remained a considerable threat. To counter its power, the Allied High Command devised an aggressive offensive aimed at weakening German war production and restricting the operational capability of its fighters through massive bombings of its airfields. On April 15th of that year, the 8th Air Force carried out a large-scale attack. The mission involved 616 P-38, P-47, and P-51 fighters, whose primary target was the air bases located in central and southern Germany. In total, 8 airfields were bombed, including the Category A installation at Hagenau. However, this operation came at a high cost for American fighter aviation. The mission resulted in the greatest loss of these aircraft in a single day throughout the war. In total, 33 fighters were shot down, including 15 P-51s. In exchange, they managed to destroy 25 enemy aircraft on the ground, 5 of which were He-177 heavy bombers. The ratio of losses to damage inflicted was clearly unfavorable for the Americans. Due to these results, no large-scale operations were undertaken for 2 days. It was not until April 18th that a force of more than 700 bombers, escorted by 600 fighters, carried out a successful attack against various aircraft factories located in southern Germany. In this offensive, the 8th Air Force lost only 19 bombers and 5 fighters, leading American commanders to believe that the balance was beginning to tilt in their favor. In the following days, efforts focused on targets in France as preparation for D-Day. Among the strategic plans was a major operation over Munich, where it was known that key airfields and essential factories for the Luftwaffe were located. Despite intense Allied pressure, German industry still maintained production of more than 100 aircraft per month. The attack was scheduled for April 24, 1944. To execute it, the 8th Air Force deployed 754 bombers and 867 fighters. The 3 bomber divisions were ordered to strike airfields and industrial installations in Munich, Freising, Erling, Gablingen and Leipheim, among others. One of the most important targets was the Dornier complex in Oberpfaffenhofen, where the Do-335 fighters were manufactured. Additionally, an offensive was planned against Lechfeld, where the advanced Me-262s were stationed, along with a key plant in jet engine production. One of the main problems was escort coverage. The P-47s and Spitfires did not have sufficient range to guarantee protection throughout the journey. Only 5 squadrons of P-51s could cover the stretch from Stuttgart to Munich, with a return via Frankfurt. To maximize air safety, the air cover was staggered and divided into different sectors. On the German side, the Luftflotte Reichsdefense was composed of fighter groups, Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, 5, 11, 27, 53, and 106, along with a unit of JG-301, plus elements of squadrons ZG-26 and ZG-76. Additionally, a temporary detachment of the 3rd Wing of JG-26 belonging to Luftflotte 3 was also present. In total, more than 275 single-engine and 40 twin-engine fighters were ready for defense. The most prevalent model in the Munich area was the Bf-109G6, although some units also operated the Bf-109G5. Additionally, a special force of attack bombers, composed of heavily armed and armored FW-190A7s, was prepared for battle. To these were added approximately 25 Me-110G2s and 12 Me-410A1s. The chosen attack route was the most direct, but also the most dangerous. The Allied bombers had to traverse a corridor densely protected by anti-aircraft batteries, extending from Augsburg to Munich. Subsequently, they would turn north and west to reach their targets north of Lake Constance, facing a dense curtain of anti-aircraft fire between Munich and Mannheim. Since late 1942, Air District 7, based in Munich-Südgarn, had been equipped with 18 advanced FUMG-65 Telefunken radars integrated into the anti-aircraft batteries of 128 mm. By April 1944, Munich's anti-aircraft defense included nearly 600 batteries of calibers ranging from 37 to 128 mm under the direction of the 4th Anti-Aircraft Brigade, which consisted of 3 flak regiments and 2 searchlight units for night detection. Another problem derived from the limited range of the escorts was the need to divide the first 2 bomber divisions west of Stuttgart due to their different targets. However, this maneuver was not without flaws, as a coordination error caused a separation of more than 10 miles between 2 groups of the 1st Division around noon, when they were executing zigzag maneuvers at varying speeds. The German surveillance forces, always vigilant, detected this gap in the formation. One group headed towards Erding and the other towards Oberpfaffenhofen. Immediately, fighters from JG-1 and JG-11 were dispatched from Augsburg to intercept them. Engaging in combat starting at 1 p.m. shortly afterward, aircraft from JG-3 and JG-2 joined the offensive, achieving the first victories. During this engagement, Captain Hermann Stiegler, commander of the 3rd Squadron of Jagdgeschwader 26, and with 42 confirmed victories, led a squadron of 30 Bf-109G6/U-4s against the B-27 bombers. Their Mk-108 30mm cannons in the nose and the two MG-151/2020mm guns under the wings demonstrated lethal effectiveness. For about 15 minutes, the B-27s, without escort coverage, suffered heavy losses. En route to Dachau, 8 bombers were shot down, while another 20 were severely damaged, and at least 4 were forced to divert to Switzerland for emergency landings. Stiegler managed to shoot down one of the bombers in this offensive, adding the first of his 4 victories that day. Meanwhile, another wave of bombers headed southeast and east of Munich to attack the region's industries. Approximately 50 Bf-109s and FEW-190s arrived from the northeast, organizing into formations of 4 aircraft each. They executed strategic attacks, crossing the B-17 formations to conduct repeated frontal offensives. In response, 2 Allied squadrons opened fire, turning the sky into a chaotic battle with streams of projectiles crisscrossing in all directions. Amid the fray, the Germans managed to shoot down 3 more bombers and several fighters, while another 5 bombers were destroyed by German anti-aircraft fire. However, they also suffered a significant loss. The ace Frank Schwager, leader of the 1st Squadron of JG-3 and with 56 confirmed victories, was hit by fire from a P-51. Although he managed to make a forced landing, he was attacked on the ground and died shortly afterward, becoming the most notable German loss that day. During the same offensive, Captain Robert Woody of the 354th Fighter Squadron of the U.S. Air Force found himself outnumbered, facing several German fighters harassing the Allied bombers alone. Despite the situation, he managed to shoot down 4 enemy aircraft, earning him the Distinguished Service Cross on May 10th. However, worse was yet to come. As the bombers completed their turn southwest and then west, a lack of coordination left some formations without fighter escort. Taking advantage of this vulnerability, the 6th Wing of JG-2, which had been patiently waiting, pounced on the B-17s located south and southwest of Munich, shooting down 2 of them. Meanwhile, more than 200 bombers carried out attacks against Oberpfaffenhofen and Luxembourg. Simultaneously, further west near Augsburg, a fierce aerial battle unfolded, involving forces from JG-3 and JG-2. In this clash, at least 8 American fighters and 9 bombers were shot down. Despite the losses suffered in the battle, the 2nd Bomber Division, which had strong support from P-51 escorts, managed to complete its mission successfully. However, the engagements continued west of Mengen, while the Allied formations attempted to regroup and received support from more fighters arriving from the rear. The battles and bombings over the strategic targets extended until after 2:30 p.m. The 3rd Wing of JG-26 distinguished itself in the engagements south and west, shooting down 8 bombers and 1 fighter without losing any of its pilots, being the only German unit that day not to suffer any losses. JG-1, on the other hand, had a less favorable performance, losing 15 aircraft, while JG-301 lost another 9. In total, the Luftwaffe suffered the destruction of 47 fighters, although only 21 pilots perished in combat. On the American side, the losses were considerable. 40 bombers shot down, of which 27 fell in the Oberpfaffenhofen area, along with the loss of 17 fighters, all of them P-51s. Additionally, 257 B-17s suffered varying degrees of damage, and at least 12 bombers were forced to land at distant airfields in Britain due to the damage sustained during the mission. Despite the losses, the bombings caused significant damage. The Dornier facilities in Oberpfaffenhofen were devastated, with the destruction of 9 Do-335 aircraft. In Erling, the 350th Bomb Group managed to destroy the 3 main hangars of the base, rendering the installation inoperable for over a month. Moreover, the airfield at Grill, near Augsburg, suffered severe damage, estimated at 50% of its operational capacity. In this attack, the commander's house was hit, resulting in the death of his 4 children. Meanwhile, in Liebe, 8 barracks were completely destroyed by the bombing. According to German records, more than 50 aircraft on the ground were destroyed, mostly medium-sized bombers. Despite the impact on some factories, German industrial production remained stable, except for the Do-335, whose manufacturing suffered a significant setback due to the extent of the damage. The Allied strategic bombings over Nazi Germany aimed to weaken its industrial capacity and affect the morale of the population. From Operation Gomorrah in Hamburg in 1943 to the destruction of Dresden in 1945, the major German cities were targets of massive air raids. Berlin, Nuremberg and Munich also suffered offensives that destroyed factories, railways and residential areas. Despite the devastation, the German war machine continued to operate until the final months of the war. The air defenses attempted to respond, but the Allied air superiority made it impossible to stop the attacks. Millions of people were displaced, and hundreds of thousands died in the bombings or from their consequences, such as lack of shelter and supplies. Although these attacks did not achieve an immediate surrender, they contributed to the collapse of the Third Reich's infrastructure and its final fall in May 1945. At the same time, they left a legacy of destruction that marked the history of the war and raised debates about the impact of bombings on the civilian population.